So here we're going to take a look at a camera that has a very unique story to it, and I'll tell you that in just a moment. This is the Belmira made by Welta. Actually, it was introduced in 1953, and production, I'm just reading from a wiki page. Anyway, this camera was introduced in 1953, but production of it didn't begin until 1956. I'm not sure how long production lasts, and as I mentioned in my What's in the Box video, this is unique because it's an East German rangefinder, and there weren't that many rangefinder cameras that came out of East Germany. Most of them were just simple scale focus models, and of course, quite a few single lens reflex cameras. When it comes to rangefinders, however, they just didn't make that many of them, and I'm not entirely sure why. It's just a curious fact. This camera had quite a few problems when it arrived. The shutter didn't work, the lens really didn't focus, the body was soiled, the viewfinder was dirty, and it pretty much had the look of a camera that hadn't been touched probably in, I would guess, at least 20 to 30 years, possibly beyond that. What we have here is we have a somewhat unusual camera in that the viewing and rangefinder window is pushed far to the left. Most of the times you'll see that this window is, your viewfinder window is actually on the right side of the camera, or if you're looking from the back, it's on this side. So the fact that it's way over here is somewhat unusual. To review the main parts of the camera, let's switch back around the front and we'll take a look at it. So this is the window for forming the rangefinder image, and it's not quite over, it's slightly overlapping. Here's your shutter release, front-mounted shutter release. You'll notice that this one is fitted with a Tessar. Some cameras came with a trioplan. This has a Weber, or I guess perhaps that's pronounced Weber, lens, or shutter, not lens, but shutter, with speeds running from 1/250th of a second down to 1 second plus B. So this one did have slow speeds. Apertures, the maximum aperture is f2.8 and the smallest aperture is f16, and here is your aperture scale. On the top deck, it's fairly simple. You have your frame counter, you have an accessory shoe, and you have a little film minder dial, which also is your rewind knob. On this side, you'll see your flash synchronization post. Now, one thing you're going to see that's missing is a knob here to wind the film. And so this actually is a push lever. So that's very different from any other camera in the fact that it is a push lever, at least for 35 millimeter. You saw a lot of these push levers when it came to 126 and let's see, no, 110 was often, anyway. You often didn't see a lever here to advance the film. This also tensions the shutter and increments your frame counter. Here's your eyepiece as mentioned. On the bottom, fairly simple, it's a rewind button. It's a press and hold rewind button. Here's your tripod socket, and you'll notice that this is the larger European socket. As I mentioned, this is the back release. Unless you actually understand the back release, there's no way of knowing which way to push it, but I'll explain that fairly soon. This is the bottom of your focusing rings. You'll see it's scalloped, and one thing you'll notice is on the top, it's smooth. So while many cameras had scallops that completely went around the circumference of the ring, that in this case is not true. Distances are marked in meters, so obviously this camera coming from East Germany probably didn't make it far beyond the East German border, perhaps to some of the Soviet satellite countries, which would be Poland, Hungary, Czechoslovakia, maybe not Czechoslovakia, but some of those other states. To remove the back, you have to actually push this to the right until this is blank. You'll see some little things in here. That's actually just part of the back closing mechanism. Push it to the right, and it's a bit difficult to open the back. This has a curious little angle, and it's an indent right here, and you can see it. I don't know why. Perhaps it's to help you remove the back. Not sure why, but eventually the back does come off with considerable force necessary to push it away. There we are. This back is very unusual in that it simply is just the back with no sides. Most cameras that had removable backs, here's an example. This one uses a key, for example. Most cameras that had removable backs, the back actually sort of wrapped around. This is very unusual that it doesn't have that. But this camera is just full of surprises, so let's go over a few more. So here's your pressure plate and a small spring to keep your film cartridge in place, or your film cassette, whatever the term you might want to use. And the purpose of the pressure plate is to keep the film flat against your film rails so that when you take your photo, you get as sharp as image as possible. There's a small little hole here. I believe this is going to be for adjusting your rangefinder. Not positive on that, but I believe that's what it's for probably tuning it. You'll notice that there's no take-up spool in this chamber. And so I believe you would need to use, well, I believe you would have to, it's very likely this came with a take-up spool, but it's no longer present. I think you could probably use an old 35 millimeters, an old spool from a 35 millimeter cassette and adapt it. Your standard cassette fits in here quite easily. No surprises. To load the film in this camera, you take that leader and you put it under this small little flap, this small little rail, and slide it under there. I would assume that you would attach it somehow to the take-up spool and start winding. The rewind knob does not extend. Some cameras it extended to make it a bit easier, but in this case, it didn't. To replace the back, simply slide it into place and then push this to the left, and the back certainly is in place. Now, what's unusual is this window is very heavily tinted. And this window is clear. Your rangefinder window is clear. The main viewfinder window is heavily tinted, and when you look through it, it in fact is somewhat darkened. But not horribly darkened, but it is somewhat darkened. So let's get out my board because I want to talk about something having to do with the viewfinder of this camera. This viewfinder has no frame lines in it. But that's not a surprise. I did not expect there to be any frame lines. One thing that's unusual is that how the rangefinder works is in most rangefinders, rangefinder cameras, I should say, you have your main viewing window, and then you'll have a central spot. Sometimes it's circular, or sometimes it's square, or rectangular. But in any case, you align two overlapping images until they form one. Then you're in focus, then you take your photo. This camera is constructed differently. And I'll show you a photo of the inner workings of this camera. You'll notice that there's this small little sliver that sticks out. And so at the end of this little sliver, which is actually just a piece of glass, there's a small mirror. Very, very thin. Only about that size, I would say, relative to the rest of the viewfinder. And this is what forms your secondary image. It's a very unusual system. I'm not entirely sure it works in this camera, and it appears that there's some degradation of the rangefinder mirror in this camera, so it's very possible it doesn't work. But I've never seen that. I've never seen this in use before, and very likely because it's, I don't know. No one has ever used it. I've thought a lot about this. And it could be an issue of materials. In order to have a true rangefinder, normally what you have is you have two prisms or two mirrors. One of these is going to be semi-transparent. So if your viewfinder here, let's say it was here, for example, this one would be a semi-transparent mirror. So what happens is your image comes in here, it reflects here, then into the eyepiece. But because this is East Germany, it could be that they weren't able to get a steady supply of semi-reflective mirrors, semi-transparent mirrors. And so that's why they went with this setup. It also could explain why you see so few rangefinder cameras coming out of East Germany from that era, or from East Germany at all. Once again, it's not to say that there were no rangefinders. It's just to say that there were very few of them relative to what others were being produced in the so-called Western countries. So when I got this camera, as I mentioned, the shutter didn't work, so I had to disassemble the shutter, clean it completely. I was going to do a video on it, but it became so problematic that I ended up disassembling the shutter down. I ended up disassembling the shutter almost entirely and then rebuild it. And that's just such an hours-long procedure. I didn't want to document it on video because it's a very lengthy, tedious process. So after you advance the film, it locks, obviously, because one shot per frame. So there's no ability to take multiple exposures on the same frame. Here's your shutter release. This is actually more of a Practica style shutter release. I think because of the presence of the viewfinder here, there was no easy way to put a shutter release here and make the camera still fairly simple to use, because then you're talking about a big reach. And at that point, you either use your middle finger or your finger begins to intrude on the viewfinder. Even here, I found that it's somewhat difficult, and in fact, they might have been better just going with the horizontal plunger type shutter release. In any case, it's angled, and you're not going to be able to do anything about it, decades after the fact. The other issue is that the focusing ring really didn't turn, and that was because one of these grub screws was damaged and the other one was missing. So I've replaced this one. This one is damaged to the extent that it probably at some point should be removed. I may or may not do this. This camera will likely just be a display piece and not actually a usable camera. This still has some significant issues, but however, they clean it up, so it looks a heck of a lot better. The handling of it is pretty nice, and it's not an overly heavy camera, so let's go ahead and weigh the camera. Let's see what this camera weighs. This camera weighs 1 pound, 3.8 ounces, or you could say 1 pound, 4 ounces. I was expecting that. In fact, I was expecting it to weigh a little bit less, so regardless, not a big surprise here. It's a nice size camera. It's not overly large and it's not overly small. And I think if everything was actually working on this camera correctly, it might be fun to take it out. I might take it out and use it just as a scale focus camera. Because it is a leaf shutter, it's a fairly quiet camera. The shutter, of course, doesn't make much noise. There's no mirror to be slapping around, and so it works pretty well. The eyepiece itself is fairly simple. This is just really an eyepiece, and this is not a magnifying lens or reducing lens. It really is just a plain piece of what appears to be smoked glass. The one thing that this camera is really good at is collecting fingerprints right on this viewfinder window, on the viewfinder glass. So I probably cleaned it like 4 or 5 times just getting ready for this video, and so there we go again. I wanted to clean it again. The one thing I don't like about this, I think they would have been fine just with a film advance, or even, well, I guess they really would have had to do a film advance or even possibly a retina style bottom mounted advance, is that this really requires too firm of a push near the end. I think this would have been much better with a more lightly sprung mechanism. I did clean up the body covering. I did not remove these two bumps. I might do that at some point. The body covering itself is fairly tightly bonded to it. You'll see some paint loss here and there. It's not terrible. Body covering, of course, continues to the front and on the sides, of course, and, because it's a removable back camera, it's just, well, it's sort of weird. Oh, so this piece here is just like a piece of, it's just a scrap metal, piece of metal that just comes around here, and it's held on by these 4 screws. In order to remove the top deck, you don't have to remove these, but it's probably best if you do. Finally, the unusual story about the Belmira is that production started with one company and completed by another company. A company called Belka began production of this camera in 1956. However, production was taken over in 1957 by Welta. So that is one of the most unusual things I think I've ever seen in photography. In fact, I can't recall ever where one company took over production of a camera that was introduced by a different company or created by a different company. It's possible that they all became nationalized and part of who knows what company. Let me take a quick look. Balda was founded in 1908 near Dresden. After World War II ended, Balda remained in Dresden. However, the founder of the company fled to West Germany and created another company called Balda. So for a while you had 2 companies, one in East Germany, one in West Germany, both operating under the same name of Balda. In 1951, after a trademark battle, the East German Balda became Belka. And in 1956, Belka was absorbed into that VEB camera work, Niederseititz. As I mentioned, sometimes German camera history can be very confusing. So there we have it. The Welta Belmira, a somewhat unusual camera with a somewhat unusual history. One of the few rangefinders to come out of East Germany. And, not a bad camera. Not a great camera, but not a bad camera. I hope you enjoyed this video, and if you did, be sure to hit that like and subscribe button. And if you have a camera that you'd like me to take a look at in the future, let me know in the comments below, or send me an email at contact@camera-talk.net. In the meantime, keep on taking photographs.